Hello, everyone. So one issue stands out above all others for BC voters in this federal election, according to a new Leger poll done exclusively for the Vancouver Sun and Province. Andrew Enns, Executive Vice President with Leger, joins us to discuss these poll results. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi, Harold.
Hey. So Leger uses something called the max diff methodology to tease out the relative importance of different issues. Sort of in lay terms, can you explain what this methodology is before we get into the issues?
Yeah. Well, for sure, and sure, it is a slightly different approach. I mean, oftentimes you'll just, either we'll just ask, Canadians, what's your most important issue, and we'll capture that, or we put a list in front of them and say, hey, can you rank this on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of how important it is? And those aren't bad ways to get the sentiment to kind of gauge things. The challenge sometimes that we have is that we know when people ultimately, you have to make choices sometimes in terms of what's really, what does it come down to when, and especially in elections, when you have parties coming at you with all kinds of good sounding promises. At some point, there's one that maybe sticks closer to you. And so with Max Diff, what we do is we went and followed sort of the gist of the campaigns for the first couple of weeks and sussed out 13 kind of topics that have come up in parties, different parties, all all parties have talked about. And we present that to voters, and we created basically a bit of an algorithm that takes little bundles of those issues, puts them together and presents them to voters, so groups of 4, and says, of these 4, which is your most important, and then which is your least? And then we'll jumble up those issues and present another 4 and another 4. And so the respondent actually responds to about 15 different packages. And we ensure that our whole sample gets a variety and a combination that mixes all these 13 together, and we get this trade-off perspective. And in that sense, we not only understand most, but we get least. And in that's how we sort of produce a bit of a, and so the numbers, that you're looking at going, well, geez, 10%, it may not look that powerful, but really they are fairly significant, and they are really a helpful way to really sort of parse out what stands out for voters. Possibly. I mean, sometimes there's other issues, there's intangibles like leader characteristics and others that may be factors too. But on an issue perspective, it really does help us understand where voters perceive these.
Okay, well, thanks for that explanation. So then, what is the top issue for British Columbians?
Well, you sort of let us off. The cost of living is certainly the top issue. Inflation, the cost of living, effects of inflation. Pandemic, just the pandemic situation and keeping people safe is another one that surfaces in the top tier. We saw some increased funding for healthcare. All parties have talked about it. We presented that, and that comes up quite high as an issue that people hold dearly. And then the last one is the housing affordability. Perhaps not a big surprise for British Columbia, but certainly that's and those top 4 really they're close to one another, and I would argue that those are sort of some of the ones really driving some attention right now, anyways.
And I guess there's a link between the pandemic waves and healthcare funding, at least in the.
You do see some connectivity between some of these, right? And cost of living, housing affordability, even.
Right. Yes.
And so you could boil this down to like a 2 almost, right?
Right. So when it comes to that, which parties could benefit most from that situation? Who's been out there in front, or do voters or do respondents attach any significance to one of the parties when it comes to these?
Well, it's a good question, Harold. And thinking about it, ironically, I see all 3 parties. All 3 parties are in a tie. I see all 3 parties having some opportunity with this issue matrix among voters. You see, the Liberals, obviously, they have a pandemic track record. We've seen other research. It's not that bad, in terms of the securing vaccines. So I think they feel they have something to gain. And I think they'll feel on the healthcare spending that they've got something there potentially. I think the Conservatives will feel comfortable with their cost of living and some of their conversations around inflation and telecommunication bills and things like that, and likewise the on the housing affordability. Again, economic issues and those sorts of issues tend to be areas where conservative-minded parties tend to have an ability to speak to voters, and voters will listen. And the NDP will feel that they've got some opportunity as well. I think they've been very strong and clear on housing affordability, and as well on the healthcare side. They are not shy about spending money, and plus while it didn't come up as a top issue, they've also raised pharmacare, which is a bit of a healthcare related angle as well. So I think all parties won't be completely uncomfortable with these with this issue matrix.
At the other end of the scale, then, what issues really are not resonating with people as significant in this?
Well, certainly, and maybe it comes as a bit of a surprise, but you see the childcare was down there a little bit in terms of not one that pops up. I think you see the and I don't have it quite in front of me, but the Indigenous I think on the Indigenous file it didn't come up as much. Reforming the immigration system. So there's a few that are down. I think on some of those, for example, like on the childcare, which is a fairly big promise and it's got lots of debate, but for voters, it's also very much a circumstance type of policy in terms of when you're presented three other issues beside it. If you don't have kids between the age of 1 and 11, or if you don't have, then suddenly it may be important, but is it as important as cost of living? Because I'm out of the childcare, but kind of situation. So I think that's where you have to sort of, keep in mind when you assess these a little bit.
Right. Well, that's really interesting. Are there any kind of regional differences when it comes to ranking the issues? I noticed that cost of living topped the list in every region of the province.
Yeah.
But
not a great deal, Harold. I would say that in the interior, outside of Vancouver Metro, Lower Mainland, I think you see the pandemic related, either from a health perspective or the economic recovery perspective, those diminish a little bit in terms of importance. They're a little less, and I suspect in part because probably not unlike where I'm from in Manitoba, rural parts of a province tended to be a little less impacted by the health and safety. The infections rates weren't through the roof. A lot of these places don't have big hospitals, and they probably weren't overrun by cases. And so I think you see that just being a little less important to those places, whereas obviously cost of living and housing affordability crosses the gambit.
And climate change, I mean, it's up there, but it's kind of middle of the pack, I guess.
It's kind of middle of the pack. It is a bit of an interesting one. I think it's one that we're gonna probably dig into a little bit more in terms of how people perceive that. I think you'll find some environmentalists will be a little bit concerned that it hasn't played as prominent a role in this campaign. It may be for two reasons. There's been climate change has actually been a bit of a problem for the Liberal, Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. He's been attacked a lot on his record and by both parties. Aaron O'Toole has put forward a climate change policy that, while some would say it's not the best policy, it's also not, it's probably much better than what it was in 2019. And so it hasn't generated as much debate, I think, as an issue. So yeah, it's an interesting, but you're right. It's not really where it was, I would say, in 2019, if we were to run the same exercise.
The issue of house flipping became a topic of conversation here in BC because of the Liberal candidate in Vancouver Granville. So Leger asked respondents about political candidates and real estate, and 52% of respondents said they were less likely to vote for someone who was involved in real estate speculation or house flipping. 44% were not interested in a candidate who didn't live in their riding, and 25% felt it was a negative if a candidate owned 2 or more properties. So owning property, not as big a deal, but benefiting over property.
House flipping,
like an
yeah.
issue. Is that a ballot box issue for people, or how does it play?
Well, first of all, like, I think there's two things. It's a local issue. I think
Yes.
it's and I think I raised it. I think in Vancouver, Granville, it could be a local issue, and I say that for it could manifest a couple ways. It might diminish the Liberal that candidate's vote at the ballot box. Some people may not be inclined to support that individual, whether they support another party or whether they maybe just don't bother to go out and vote. So that could be a problem. I think as well, if that candidate is trying to appeal to another party's voters to vote for them strategically, to say stop another candidate from potentially winning, that becomes problematic. We'll call it out. It's a Liberal candidate that got caught in this situation. The Liberals are fairly aggressively seeking NDP voters to say vote strategically to stop a Conservative win. It gets harder if that Liberal candidate has some baggage around, in terms of that certainly some NDP voters might find fairly distasteful, right? And that's the case in our polling. We found that NDP voters were particularly distressed by this notion of house flipping.
Right. Well, that's interesting. So it could have effect on strategic voting in a way.
Yeah.
Then the other thing is, this really has been a divisive and increasingly negative campaign on all sides. So I know you asked in this poll, which party leader can best bring the country together after Monday? And Trudeau and Singh topped the poll at 27% each, and O'Toole trailed at 20%. The numbers for Trudeau and Singh seem to be fairly close to the numbers that they get for popular support, but O'Toole's is significantly lower. Some of the people who say they're going to vote for him don't seem to believe that he's the best to unite the country. Is there a disconnect here? Why would the numbers not line up?
It's a good question. I've looked at that too, trying to how to square that. I mean, I think there's a couple of factors at play, Harold. I think one, it's still this notion of there's awareness of O'Toole, but there's not familiarity with Aaron O'Toole, and I think that can factor in a little bit, even for people who are voting for Aaron O'Toole. I think, because I think in this campaign, you're right, it's been a pretty divisive kind of campaign, and it's getting a bit negative. I think what you have some people voting for the Conservatives, not necessarily because they like Aaron O'Toole, but they dislike Justin Trudeau, and they're not necessarily going to go all the way over to Jagmeet Singh. And so they're Liberal Conservative switchers, and so they may have said, it's time for change. I like the fiscal sense of the sort of reputation of the Conservatives, and so they've switched their vote. But that doesn't necessarily mean they have great great sort of love with the leader. He just hasn't maybe turned them off. Right. I think the second thing that's a little bit here is that you've also got some in British Columbia, I would say is probably. It's fairly acute here, is where the Conservative Party itself separate the leader, but the Conservative Party has some brand challenges in terms of being a bit stodgy, and it still carries some of the baggage from I would say the Harper era, and even some of the things around, even with Andrew Scheer as leader in 2019, that aren't what people would consider sort of uniting type issues. There are more issues that sort of divide, and that may be contributing a little bit where the Conservative leader now, even though I think he's really made a reasonable effort of trying to take the edge off some of those conservative, some of those historical conservative issues that have always plagued the party in elections. But yeah, it could be contributing a little bit to this.
Yes. Well, very interesting. Okay, well, thanks again, Andrew. Always great to hear from you, and we'll be back on Friday, and we'll get a final look at what you think might unfold on Monday. Are we going to have a minority government, a majority government, new party, same party? Boy, lots still to be decided. We may not know on Friday. We may not even know on Monday, depending on how close things are.
Harold, I can't wait to join you on Friday and get all your predictions.
All right. Okay. All right, Andrew. Thanks. Talk to you then.
You bet.